All names, places, and institutions are aliases used to protect privacy. Procedures and timelines reflect real-world law and forensics for immersion. The holding cell smells like institutional soap and 19 winters of exhaled hope. Rook sits on the steel bench, hands folded between his knees, staring at a water stain shaped like a question mark on the concrete floor. 60 feet away, through 2 locked doors and a corridor that amplifies every footfall, the appellate panel is reviewing the single piece of paper that could end this, or bury him for good. His attorney, a woman named North, promised him she would call the moment the judges released their opinion. That was 4 hours ago. The phone on the guard's desk has not rung. 27 years is a catalogue of erosion. Rook's mother died during year 9. His younger sister stopped writing during year 14. He has become fluent in the language of denial. Motion denied, appeal denied, petition for post-conviction relief denied, and he has learned that innocence is not a spell that breaks chains. It is a claim you repeat in courtroom after courtroom, each time to a new set of faces who have heard it all before. But this time, something is different. 3 months ago, a forensic analyst named Juniper sent North a 14-page report with the subject line, "Reanalysis complete. Findings diverge from original testimony." The divergence was not subtle, it was categorical. The case against Rook had always rested on one immovable fact: the murder weapon. It was found in his apartment, wrapped in a towel beneath his bathroom sink, 2 days after a man named Victor was shot to death in a parking garage in the city of Riverbend. The firearm, a 9mm semi-automatic, bore Victor's blood on the slide and Rook's fingerprints on the grip. At trial, the prosecutor, a man known as Slate, built his case on that union of evidence. Blood plus prints equals guilt. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Rook was 23 years old when they convicted him. He is 50 now. What never fit, the splinter that has lodged in North's mind since she inherited this case 3 years ago, is the timeline. Rook was arrested 72 hours after the shooting, and during those 72 hours, he was visible. A convenience store receipt placed him buying cigarettes 40 minutes after Victor died. A neighbor saw him walking his dog that evening. His parole officer interviewed him by phone the next morning. Rook had been on parole for a non-violent theft conviction and was required to check in twice a week. None of that saved him, because none of that explained the weapon. Until Juniper's report, no one could explain how a man could commit a murder, hide the gun in his own apartment, and then behave as though nothing had happened. No attempt to flee, no attempt to dispose of evidence, no awareness that the walls were closing in. If you're following this story and you're curious how forensic science and legal procedure intersect to free or trap the innocent, hit subscribe and drop a comment. These cases hinge on details that take years to surface, and every detail matters. Victor was shot 3 times in the underground parking structure of the Granite County Municipal Complex at 11:45 on a Thursday night. He was a mid-level accountant for a private firm. He worked late that evening preparing tax filings and was walking to his sedan when the shooter approached. Witnesses on the street level heard the shots, sharp, percussive echoes that reverberated up the concrete ramp, but no one saw the assailant. By the time the first patrol unit arrived, Victor was slumped against the rear tire of his car, unresponsive. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. The crime scene was photographed and gridded by a team from the Riverbend Police Department. Lead Detective Harbour catalogued the evidence. 3 spent 9mm casings, a pool of blood. Victor's wallet still in his pocket, his briefcase undisturbed. No firearm was recovered at the scene. Surveillance cameras in the garage had been offline for maintenance, a fact that would later haunt the investigation. The medical examiner, a woman named Crescent, determined that Victor died from a single gunshot wound to the chest. The other 2 rounds struck his shoulder and abdomen, but were not immediately fatal. Crescent estimated time of death as between 11:30 and midnight. The investigation pivoted within 48 hours. A jailhouse informant named Pike, serving time in the Granite County lockup on a drug charge, told his cellmate that he had heard Rook bragging about taking care of business in a parking garage. The cellmate, eager to reduce his own sentence, relayed the statement to a guard, who relayed it to Detective Harbour. Pike agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. According to Pike, Rook had described the shooting in detail. 3 rounds fired. Victim went down fast. Weapon ditched at home because they'd never look there. Harbour obtained a warrant and searched Rook's apartment, a 1-bedroom walk-up in a working-class neighborhood 6 miles from the municipal complex. The 9mm was found in the bathroom, wrapped in a blue towel, tucked behind a box of cleaning supplies. The weapon was logged, photographed and sent to the Arcadia Crime Lab for analysis. Forensic analyst Juniper, then a junior technician, newly hired, conducted the examination. She swabbed the slide for biological material and found trace amounts of blood that matched Victor's type. She lifted fingerprints from the grip and compared them to Rook's prints on file from his prior conviction. 3 ridge patterns matched. Her report concluded, firearm exhibits blood consistent with victim, latent prints consistent with defendant. Rook was arrested the following morning. He told Detective Harbour he had never seen the weapon before. He said he had no idea how it ended up in his apartment. He said he had been at home the night of the murder, alone, watching television. Harbour documented the denials, but the evidence spoke louder. Rook had a criminal record, albeit for theft, not violence, and Pike's testimony provided motive, a debt, allegedly unpaid, stemming from a dispute over money Rook owed Victor for a car repair months earlier. The DA's office, under the direction of Slate, filed charges, first-degree murder with premeditation. Rook's public defender, a young attorney named Frost, mounted a defense constrained by limited resources and overwhelming physical evidence. Frost challenged Pike's credibility, pointing out his incentive to fabricate, but Pike's story was detailed and internally consistent. Frost questioned the lack of gunshot residue on Rook's hands. Rook had been swabbed during booking, and the test came back negative, but Slate argued that 72 hours was more than enough time for residue to dissipate through normal washing. Frost requested funds to hire an independent forensic expert to re-examine the weapon, but the motion was denied. The court found the Arcadia Lab's analysis sufficient. The trial lasted 8 days. Slate's opening statement was a model of prosecutorial clarity. The defendant shot Victor 3 times, hid the weapon in his own home, and thought he could get away with it. The evidence will show you that the murder weapon was found in the defendant's apartment, bearing the victim's blood and the defendant's fingerprints. That is not coincidence. That is guilt. Pike testified for 2 hours, describing Rook's alleged confession in the county jail. Juniper testified about the blood and fingerprints, using slides and magnified images to show the jury the ridge patterns and the reddish-brown smear on the slide. Victor's widow testified about her husband's character and the devastation his death had caused. Frost's cross-examination of Pike was aggressive. He accused Pike of inventing the story to save himself, but Pike did not waver. Frost's cross-examination of Juniper was cautious. He lacked the technical expertise to challenge her methodology, and Juniper's testimony was delivered with the calm authority of scientific certainty. Rook took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that Frost reluctantly endorsed. Rook testified that he had never owned a firearm, that he had no reason to harm Victor, and that the weapon must have been planted. Slate's cross-examination was withering. You're telling this jury that someone framed you. Who? Why? Where's your proof? Rook had no answers. The jury convicted him on all counts. The judge, a veteran of the bench named Keystone, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, Keystone noted the cold-blooded nature of the crime and the defendant's refusal to accept responsibility. Rook was transported to the state penitentiary the following week. Prison is a machine that extracts years and returns nothing. Rook was assigned to a cell in the maximum security wing, where he shared 100 square feet with a man serving time for armed robbery. He worked in the laundry, processing uniforms and bedding in 12-hour shifts, earning 19 cents an hour. He filed his first appeal within 6 months, represented by a court-appointed attorney who recycled Frost's arguments and added nothing new. The appellate court affirmed the conviction. The evidence was sufficient, the trial was fair, no reversible error. Rook filed a motion for post-conviction relief at year 4, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel. He claimed Frost should have hired a forensic expert to challenge Juniper's testimony. The motion was denied. The court found that Frost's performance, while not exemplary, did not fall below the constitutional minimum. Rook filed a petition for a new trial at year 7, based on newly discovered evidence. Pike had recanted his testimony in a sworn affidavit, admitting that he fabricated the jailhouse confession under pressure from Detective Harbour. The petition was denied. The court ruled that Pike's recantation was not credible because he had since been convicted of perjury in an unrelated case. By year 12, Rook had exhausted his direct appeals and his state post-conviction remedies. His case was closed. But the weapon, the one fact that never fit, continued to gnaw at those who paid attention. Rook's sister, a woman named Clara, never stopped writing letters. She wrote to journalists, to advocacy groups, to law school innocence clinics. Most letters went unanswered, but in year 23, one reached the desk of Attorney North, who directed a small innocence project affiliated with a regional university. North reviewed the case file and was struck by the absence of a coherent narrative. Why would Rook, if guilty, keep the weapon in his apartment for 3 days? Why would he continue his daily routines without attempting to flee? And why would Pike, a convicted perjurer, be the linchpin of the state's theory of motive? North filed a motion under the state's post-conviction DNA testing statute, which allows defendants to request reanalysis of biological evidence using methods that were unavailable at the time of trial. The statute had been enacted a decade after Rook's conviction, part of a wave of criminal justice reforms driven by exonerations in other jurisdictions. The motion requested retesting of the blood on the weapon using short tandem repeat analysis, a technique far more precise than the ABO blood typing used by Juniper in the original case. The DA's office, now led by a prosecutor named Vance, opposed the motion, arguing that the testing would be redundant and that the fingerprints alone were sufficient for conviction. Judge Keystone, still on the bench, granted the motion. In the interest of justice, and given the availability of new technology, the court will permit reanalysis. The firearm had been stored in the Arcadia Labs evidence vault for 24 years, sealed in a cardboard box with a chain of custody log stapled to the lid. Juniper, now the lab's senior analyst, personally retrieved the weapon and delivered it to an independent laboratory in the neighboring state, a facility accredited by the National Forensic Science Technology Center. The lab assigned the case to a specialist named Orion, who conducted a meticulous examination. He swabbed the slide, the grip, and the trigger. He used sterile instruments and fresh reagents to avoid contamination. He extracted DNA from the biological material and amplified it using polymerase chain reaction. Then he generated a profile using 16 genetic markers and compared it to reference samples from Victor, Rook, and Pike. The results, delivered in a sealed report 3 months later, were unequivocal. The blood on the slide matched Victor's DNA profile, but the DNA on the grip, beneath Rook's fingerprints, matched neither Rook nor Victor. It matched Pike. The revelation was a seismic shift. but it required careful interpretation. DNA beneath fingerprints suggests layering. The DNA was deposited first, the prints second. In other words, Pike had handled the weapon, leaving behind skin cells, and then someone else, or Pike himself, had transferred Rook's fingerprints onto the grip. The mechanism was not mysterious. Forensic experts have documented cases in which prints are lifted from one surface using tape or gelatin and transferred to another. It is labor-intensive and requires access to the source prints, but it is feasible, especially for someone with law enforcement access. North filed an emergency motion for an evidentiary hearing, attaching Orion's report and a supplemental affidavit from Juniper. In her affidavit, Juniper explained that the original testing in her lab had been limited to ABO blood typing and visual fingerprint comparison. She had not conducted DNA analysis because the technology was prohibitively expensive at the time, and the blood type match was considered sufficient. She also noted that she had been pressured by Detective Harbour to expedite the analysis. Harbour had told her that the case was high profile and that delay would jeopardize public confidence. Juniper stated, "With the benefit of hindsight and advances in technology, it is now apparent that the original conclusion was incomplete and potentially misleading." Prosecutor Vance, in a tersely worded opposition brief, argued that the DNA findings did not exonerate Rook. The presence of Pike's DNA on the grip is consistent with Pike having handled the weapon prior to the crime, possibly during a transaction or loan. It does not preclude the defendant from firing the weapon, but North countered with a timeline analysis. Pike had been incarcerated in the Granite County Jail on the night of Victor's murder, serving a 30-day sentence for possession. Jail logs confirmed that Pike had been locked down at the time of the shooting. He could not have been the shooter. The only way Pike's DNA could have ended up on the weapon was if he handled it before the crime, and if the weapon was then used by someone else, or if the weapon was handled by Pike after the crime, during the investigation. North subpoenaed Pike's jail records and Pike's visitor logs. She discovered that Detective Harbour had visited Pike 3 times in the week before the search warrant was executed on Rook's apartment. The visits were logged as investigative interviews, but no audio or video recordings had been made. The jail's interview rooms were not equipped with recording devices at the time. North also obtained Pike's cell phone records from the period before his incarceration. The records showed multiple calls between Pike and an untraceable number that North's investigator linked to a burner phone purchased with cash in Riverbend 2 weeks before Victor's murder. The calls stopped the day Pike was jailed. The picture was becoming clear. Pike had been involved in Victor's murder, possibly as an accomplice or a witness. When he was arrested on unrelated charges days later, he became vulnerable. Detective Harbour, under pressure to solve a high-profile homicide, saw an opportunity. He visited Pike in jail, showed him evidence, and offered him a deal: testify against Rook and walk on the drug charge. Pike agreed. But to make the frame convincing, the weapon needed to tie Rook to the crime. Pike, who had handled the gun and left his DNA on it, provided Harbour with the means. Rook's fingerprints, easily obtained from his prior arrest records, were transferred onto the grip using a technique known as latent print fabrication. The weapon was planted in Rook's apartment during a staged search. It was a bold theory, and it required evidence beyond circumstantial inference. North needed more. She hired a forensic consultant named Arden, an expert in fingerprint transfer and evidence tampering. Arden examined high-resolution photographs of the weapon taken during the original evidence processing. He noted several anomalies. The fingerprints on the grip were unusually clear, with no smudging or partial impressions typical of natural handling. The prints were also positioned in a way that suggested the weapon had been held in a precise, unnatural grip. Arden concluded The clarity and positioning of the latent prints are consistent with transfer rather than direct contact. This is a hallmark of fabricated evidence. North also re-interviewed the neighbor who had seen Rook walking his dog on the night of the murder. The neighbor, a man named Ellis, had testified at trial, but had never been asked about the exact time he saw Rook. North showed Ellis the police timeline and asked him to be more specific. Ellis checked his phone records. He had made a call to his daughter that night and confirmed that he saw Rook at 11:55, 10 minutes after Victor was shot and 6 miles away. The timeline made it physically impossible for Rook to have been the shooter. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for a late afternoon in November, 27 years and 4 months after Rook's conviction. The courtroom was half full. Clara sat in the front row, flanked by 2 journalists and a law student intern from North's clinic. Prosecutor Vance sat at the state's table, flanked by Detective Harbour, now retired, and a junior assistant DA. Rook was escorted in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and wrist restraints, his hair fully grey, his posture compressed by decades of incarceration. Judge Keystone, now in his 70s, presided. North called Orion first. He testified about the DNA extraction process, the STR analysis, and the match to Pike. He explained the concept of DNA transfer and the significance of finding Pike's genetic material beneath Rook's fingerprints. Vance's cross-examination focused on the possibility of innocent transfer. Could Pike have touched the weapon during a casual interaction weeks before the crime? Orion acknowledged the theoretical possibility, but noted that Pike's DNA was found in a quantity consistent with direct, prolonged handling, not incidental contact. North called Juniper next. She testified about the original testing and the pressure she had felt to deliver quick results. She stated, "At the time, I believed I was following standard protocol. I now understand that the absence of gunshot residue on the defendant, combined with the defendant's fingerprints on a weapon that bore another person's DNA, should have prompted further investigation." Vance objected to the characterization, arguing that Juniper was engaging in speculation. Judge Keystone overruled the objection. "The witness is offering expert opinion based on current forensic standards. I'll allow it." North called Arden. He testified about the fingerprint anomalies and the possibility of transfer. He showed the court enlarged photographs of the weapon, pointing out the unnatural clarity of the prints. He explained the process of latent print fabrication. Prints are lifted from a known source using gelatin or adhesive tape, then transferred to a target surface by applying pressure. This technique has been documented in forensic literature and has been used in other evidence tampering cases, Arden said. The prints on this weapon exhibit characteristics consistent with transfer. North called Ellis. He testified about seeing Rook at 11:55 on the night of the murder. He showed the court his phone records, confirming the exact time. "I remember it clearly because I was on the phone with my daughter, and Rook walked past with his dog. I waved at him. It was 11:55. The testimony demolished the prosecution's timeline. If Rook was 6 miles away at 11:55, he could not have shot Victor at 11:45. North called Pike. He appeared via video link from a federal prison in another state where he was serving a 15-year sentence for multiple fraud convictions. Pike invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer any questions. North entered into evidence Pike's original recantation affidavit from year 7, in which he admitted fabricating the jailhouse confession. She also entered Pike's visitor logs and phone records. The records showed that Pike had communicated with Harbour before the search warrant was executed, and that Pike had been promised leniency in exchange for his testimony. North called Clara. She testified about Rook's character, his lack of violent history, and his consistent protestations of innocence. It was not legal evidence. But it was human context, and Judge Keystone listened intently. Clara described the toll the conviction had taken on the family, their mother's decline, the years of silence, the burden of knowing Rook was innocent, but unable to prove it. "We never stopped believing him," Clara said. "We never stopped fighting." North rested. Vance called Detective Harbour. Harbour testified that his investigation had been thorough, and that he had no reason to believe the weapon had been tampered with. He denied pressuring Juniper or fabricating evidence. When North cross-examined him, she asked, "Did you visit Pike in jail 3 times in the week before you searched Rook's apartment?" Harbour confirmed the visits. "Did you discuss the weapon with Pike during those visits?" Harbour paused. "I may have mentioned that we were looking for the firearm. Did you show Pike a photograph of the weapon?" Another pause. "I may have shown him an image from our evidence database." "Was that image taken before or after the weapon was recovered?" Harbour hesitated. I'm not certain." North produced a document, a lab log from Arcadia, showing that the photograph in question had been taken 2 days after the weapon was found. She showed it to Harbour. "This image could not have been shown to Pike before the weapon was recovered, because it didn't exist yet. So when you showed Pike this image, the weapon had already been found. Correct?" Harbour's face reddened. "I suppose so." Judge Keystone leaned forward. "Detective Harbour, did you have access to the weapon before it was logged into evidence?" Harbour shook his head. "No, Your Honor. Once it was recovered, it went directly to the lab." "And yet Mr. Pike's DNA is on that weapon, and Mr. Pike was in jail at the time of the murder. How do you account for that?" Harbour had no answer. Vance declined to call additional witnesses. In his closing argument, he maintained that the DNA findings were ambiguous and that Rook's fingerprints remained unexplained, but North's closing was surgical. She laid out the timeline. Pike handled the weapon before the crime, possibly in collaboration with the true shooter. Detective Harbour, under pressure to close a high-profile case, focused on Rook because of his prior record and his lack of an alibi. Pike, facing his own charges, agreed to fabricate a confession in exchange for leniency. Harbour visited Pike in jail, showed him evidence, and coached him on the details. The weapon was planted in Rook's apartment, and Rook's fingerprints were transferred onto the grip using a method common in evidence fabrication. "This is not a case of mistaken identity," North said. "This is a case of deliberate framing, and the DNA proves it." Judge Keystone took 3 weeks to issue his ruling. The opinion was 32 pages long. He found that the DNA evidence, combined with the timeline discrepancies and Pike's documented perjury, undermines the integrity of the original conviction to such a degree that no reasonable jury, properly instructed, would convict beyond a reasonable doubt. He vacated the conviction and ordered the state to either retry Rook within 90 days or dismiss the charges. Prosecutor Vance, in a public statement, declined to retry. "In light of the new evidence, the state cannot meet its burden of proof. The charges are dismissed." Rook was released on a Thursday morning, processed out through the same steel doors he had entered 27 years earlier. The sky was overcast, the air cold. Clara met him at the gate along with North and a volunteer from the Innocence Clinic. They drove to a diner in Riverbend, where Rook ordered pancakes and coffee, and ate in silence, overwhelmed by the noise of traffic and the sight of strangers moving freely. North explained the next steps: applying for a certificate of innocence, filing a claim for compensation under the state's wrongful conviction statute, petitioning for expungement of the arrest and conviction records. The process would take months, possibly years. Compensation, when it finally came, amounted to $50,000 per year of incarceration, just over $3 million. It was not restitution, it was acknowledgement, cold and insufficient. Rook used the money to rent a small apartment and enroll in a community college program for auto mechanics, a trade he had learned in prison. He avoided journalists, declined interviews, and rebuilt his life in increments: a driver's license, a bank account, a job at a repair shop where the owner asked no questions. The case prompted a statewide audit of the Arcadia Crime Lab's evidence handling procedures. The audit revealed systemic deficiencies, inadequate chain of custody documentation, failure to record interrogations, and lack of independent oversight for forensic analysts. The state legislature passed a law requiring electronic recording of all custodial interrogations and mandatory accreditation for crime labs. Detective Harbour retired under scrutiny but was never criminally charged. Prosecutors determined that they could not prove intent to fabricate beyond a reasonable doubt. Pike served out his federal sentence and was released on parole. He never spoke publicly about his role in Rook's conviction. Juniper left the Arcadia lab and now consults for innocence projects, training analysts on the importance of skepticism and thoroughness. She keeps a copy of Rook's case file on her desk, a reminder of what can go wrong when science is rushed or coerced. Every sample tells a story, she says in training sessions, but we have to be willing to listen, even when the story contradicts the theory. Rook sees Clara twice a month. They sit at her kitchen table at dawn, drinking coffee, talking about their mother, about the years lost. The evidence box that once held the weapon sits empty now, stored in a courthouse basement, a relic of a system that failed and then, belatedly, corrected itself. Rook does not speak of forgiveness or bitterness. He speaks of small things: the taste of fresh coffee, the sound of rain on a window, the simple fact of being able to walk outside without permission. The weapon that framed him was destroyed after the case was closed, melted down and repurposed, its steel absorbed into something new. The truth it carried, layered in DNA and lies, surfaced only because someone refused to stop asking why. That is the lesson of wrongful convictions. Innocence is not self-evident. It must be proven again and again until the system finally listens. Wrongful convictions are not anomalies. They are systemic failures with identifiable causes. Rook's case exemplifies several: jailhouse informants incentivized to lie, forensic evidence accepted without independent verification, investigative tunnel vision that ignores exculpatory facts, and the absence of procedural safeguards like recorded interrogations and open-file discovery. Each factor compounds the others, creating a cascade of error that can trap an innocent person for decades. The role of DNA technology in exoneration cannot be overstated. Since the advent of post-conviction DNA testing, hundreds of wrongfully convicted individuals have been freed. But DNA is only useful when biological evidence exists and when it is preserved properly. In Rook's case, the weapon was stored in a sealed evidence vault, protected from contamination and degradation. In other cases, evidence is destroyed, lost, or improperly handled, closing the door to exoneration permanently. This underscores the need for rigorous evidence preservation protocols and for statutes that mandate long-term storage of biological material. The concept of latent print transfer, fingerprint fabrication, is less widely understood but equally important. Fingerprints are often treated as infallible evidence, but they can be manipulated. The technique used to frame Rook, lifting prints from a known source and transferring them to a target object, has been documented in forensic literature and has been used in other evidence tampering cases. Defense attorneys and forensic experts must be trained to recognize the signs of transfer: unnatural clarity, positioning inconsistent with normal handling, and absence of smudging. Courts must be willing to entertain challenges to fingerprint evidence, especially when other factors, like the absence of gunshot residue or an ironclad alibi, suggest innocence. The testimony of jailhouse informants is another major source of wrongful convictions. Informants have powerful incentives to fabricate, reduce sentences, better conditions, or freedom. Pike's testimony was the keystone of the prosecution's case, yet it was built on lies. His recantation years later should have triggered immediate review, but the court dismissed it because Pike had been convicted of perjury in an unrelated case. This catch-22, informants are unreliable, so recantations are unreliable. Traps defendants in a cycle of injustice. Some jurisdictions now require corroboration of jailhouse informant testimony or prohibit its use altogether. These reforms are essential. Eyewitness identification is another well-documented source of error, though it was not a factor in Rook's case. Memory is malleable, and witnesses can be influenced by suggestive lineup procedures or leading questions. Ellis, the neighbor who saw Rook at the time of the murder, provided exculpatory evidence, but he was never asked the right questions during the original investigation. This highlights the importance of thorough, unbiased investigation. Detectives must pursue all leads, not just those that confirm their theory. The pressure on law enforcement to solve high-profile cases can lead to tunnel vision and investigative shortcuts. Detective Harbour was under pressure to close Victor's murder quickly, and he fixated on Rook because of Rook's prior record and the lack of other suspects. This confirmation bias blinded him to exculpatory evidence and made him susceptible to manipulation by Pike. Independent oversight of investigations, cold case reviews, prosecutor conviction integrity units, and external audits can help counteract tunnel vision. Forensic labs must operate with independence and transparency. Juniper's initial analysis was influenced by Harbour's pressure to deliver quick results, and she lacked the resources to conduct more advanced testing. Crime labs should be independent of law enforcement agencies, with clear protocols for handling evidence, conducting tests, and reporting results. Analysts must be free to follow the science wherever it leads, without fear of professional consequences for delivering inconvenient findings. Post-conviction relief mechanisms are critical, but they are often difficult to access. Rook exhausted his direct appeals and his initial post-conviction motions, and his case was closed for over a decade before North reopened it. The state's DNA testing statute, enacted years after Rook's conviction, provided the legal mechanism for reanalysis. More jurisdictions should adopt similar statutes and should remove procedural barriers that prevent defendants from accessing new evidence. Actual innocence should be a gateway to relief, even when procedural defaults or statutes of limitation would otherwise bar review. The role of innocence projects and pro bono attorneys cannot be overstated. North's clinic took on Rook's case when no one else would. These organizations operate on shoestring budgets, relying on volunteers and donations to investigate claims, hire experts, and litigate appeals. They are essential to the functioning of the criminal justice system, yet they are chronically underfunded. Legislatures should provide robust funding for innocence work, and law schools should expand clinical programs that train students to handle post-conviction cases. Compensation for the wrongfully convicted is a matter of justice, but it is inadequate in most jurisdictions. Rook received $50,000 per year of incarceration, a sum that cannot restore the years he lost or the relationships that were destroyed. Some states provide no compensation at all. Others cap damages or impose procedural hurdles that make recovery difficult. Compensation should be automatic, generous, and accompanied by social services, job training, housing assistance, mental health counseling, and assistance with record clearing. Exonerees face enormous challenges reintegrating into society, and they deserve support commensurate with the harm they suffered. The systemic reforms prompted by Rook's case, mandatory recording of interrogations, crime lab accreditation, evidence preservation protocols, are steps in the right direction, but they are not universal. Many jurisdictions lag behind, and many wrongful convictions continue to occur. The lesson of Rook's case is that wrongful convictions are preventable. They result from identifiable errors and failures, and they can be reduced through procedural reforms, technological advances, and a commitment to truth over expedience. Rook's story ends not with vengeance or closure, but with quiet persistence. He rebuilt his life one day at a time, finding meaning in small routines and human connections. Clara never gave up, and North never stopped fighting. Juniper confronted her role in the original injustice and dedicated her career to preventing future errors. The system failed Rook, but individuals within the system, flawed, human, determined, eventually corrected that failure. That is the paradox of wrongful convictions. They reveal the worst of the criminal justice system, but they also reveal its capacity for redemption. If this story moved you or made you think differently about justice, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Every case like Rook's is a reminder that the system is only as good as the people who demand accountability, who refuse to accept convenient lies, and who insist that innocence matters even when proving it takes 27 years.